Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexei, and today I have a special guest, Daath Otero. Daath Otero is a metal sound engineer who has been working with such great metal bands as Archspire, Decapitation, Daath, and many more. Also, Daath has wonderful videos on courses on Nail the Mix, the best online community on recording, mixing, and mastering metal music. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel today, Daath, and let's start our interview. So, not to waste your precious time, let's start our interview. And my first question is, how you became a sound engineer?
Probably the similar story to a lot of different producers, studio guys. Just was playing in my own bands and wanted to have recordings for cheap or just get recordings, period. And then kind of just started experimenting with even it's like 4 tracks. You know, I started in the very, very basic equipment. And then just kind of went from there, sort of fell in love with that aspect of music. Learned that I had some talents at it, when I first started, and just kind of kept on going down that path.
How you got into mixing metal?
Same kind of thing. I was in kind of like punk and metal bands from an early age, I guess. So that was like just the music that I just gravitated towards naturally. And it just made sense for me to stick in that genre, with what I knew and what I was comfortable with and where I had kind of knowledge of the music space. So I started recording my own bands, which were metal bands and punk bands early on. And then started recording my friends' bands, which are obviously like from the same scene. And it kind of just like went from there.
When you should use key spikes for cleaning drums from the bleed, and when you should use plugins like Silencer?
For me, the key spike thing, which I think you're familiar with, and I've kind of gone over a few times on Nail the Mix and some of the ORM stuff. For me, that's just pretty much part of my workflow. So I just want that every time. It's just like a thing I don't have to worry about. I haven't played around too much with Silencer in particular. I do know another trick that people have been using lately. I think Nolly kind of brought into the heavy music sphere is using the dynamics knob on Saturn. That actually does work surprisingly well. And the nice thing about that is it is zero latency. So I've kind of moved over to using that when I'm tracking drums or anything that needs gating live, because it's super fast to set up and it's definitely good enough for controlling some bleed in a situation where the fidelity, complete control isn't absolutely necessary. Like when you're tracking drums, as long as what's being recorded to disc or to tape is of high quality, then you can get away with just like a tracking reference that's maybe the gate isn't perfect and is removing some snap or isn't completely transparent. Doesn't really matter. You just need to hear the drums and be able to get a good mix for yourself and for the artist. So I've moved over to that for live situations, but when I'm mixing, for me, I'm just always going to use the key spike combination with a multi-band expander, which for me is just Pro MB. So it just kind of gives me the ultimate control, and I don't really feel the need to do anything else. Does everything I need to.
What is your favorite approach in creating key spikes for drums? Do you create MIDI files or do you use Slate Trigger to create key spikes?
Well, so both actually. And I'll preface this by saying that 9 times out of 10 these days, my assistant is going to be handling the drums to MIDI, which is what I also use for my key spikes. So I'm not doing that most of the time, but the method that he uses and the method that I will use in the case that I'm doing it myself, it's typically using Trigger to create MIDI notes, and then I'll have a full representation of the drum performance with MIDI of at least the shells, usually only the shells. And then I will use that MIDI to run a sampler and create my key spikes in real time. That way, everything is infinitely editable. Because that MIDI is also controlling any sampling that I'm layering in with the drums. So if I'm going to mix a kick sample or mix a snare sample, it's it's that same MIDI is going to control those samples as well as any gating. So I like leaving it in an editable stage, because typically with velocities in particular of those snare samples or kick samples that I'm blending, I'm going to want to be able to modify the velocity of those samples all the way up to potentially the very end of the mix phase. Sometimes I find that until the mix really takes shape, you can't exactly know where you want the velocity range to land for blast beat sections or for double bass sections. Those are things I'm going to want to adjust listening to what is essentially a finished mix. And since everything is running off these the live MIDI, it makes it really easy just to adjust things all the way through to the very end. So yeah, it's a bit of a complicated process, but the drums will, I'll use Slate Trigger to turn the drums into MIDI notes. The MIDI notes live in the session and are kind of like an alive part of the session that I can change at any point. They're controlling samples that I'm layering, and also the same MIDI notes are running into a sampler that's just running like a tick sound, and I'm using that tick sound as my audio key spikes that I then sidechain into the multiband compressors for the gating. So it's a lot to set up, but when you do, you kind of have ultimate control, and everything just comes from the one source, that live MIDI.
What tips can you give on creating a good bass tone for a metal mix?
Bass tone in particular is pretty dependent on the source. So, and by the source, I mean everything before you're actually dialing in tones and DW. So that's the player, that's the strings, that's what they're using to play the bass. That's kind of like similar to the player, but it could be picks or fingers. The strings, I think I mentioned already. The bass in particular has a huge effect. Like, there's such a wide range of sounds you get from different basses. So that's the first place to start is the source. In cases where you're mixing, you don't have control over that. You get what you get, you know? So lately I've been doing a good amount of EQing to the DI tracks. I have a few references of basses that I've recorded myself that I know I really like the shape and sound of. And these are like high quality basses with well regarded, you know, metal pedigree, if you will, like Spectre basses and Warwick basses and Dingwall basses that have a really nice sound with steel strings, which is kind of my preferred string in most scenarios, nice and bright. So I've got some references that I know will result in a killer sound. And you can actually gain a lot of ground by EQing a bass DI to sort of fit a mold of another sound that you like. So it's hard to, I wouldn't necessarily say I start with that, because everything you kind of have to do all sides at the same time. But I will dial up, you know, usually a bass amp sim that's going to be Parallax in a lot of cases, or a JST Hellraiser in a lot of cases. Sometimes I'm using the B7K pedal, again from Dark Glass and Neural DSP, a range of others. I'll dial up a close sound, and then I'll start playing around with that EQ on the bass DI if I find it necessary, auditioning through those amp sims. And I'll start with something that I know really well, like Parallax is definitely one of my go-tos, and I know what a good bass sound will sound like coming through that plugin. So I'll dial up a kind of standard tone that I know and I like, and then I'll EQ the bass DI, as well as sometimes add compression, sometimes additional outboard stuff, and then kind of work all sides at the same time. So you're dialing in the amp, you're dialing in the EQ on the bass DI. You know, these are things I lean on more in a mixing only scenario where I don't really have control over the source. If I do have control over the source, then a lot goes into the selection of the bass guitar and the strings, and a lot goes into coaching the artist to perform the way that I know is going to result in the best bass tone. So that's consistency in their playing, you know, making the decision on pick or fingers. If it's a pick, it's deciding the material of the pick and the weight of the pick. All these things make a big difference in a final bass tone. So depends on what you can control, but between all of those variables, I've been able to get pretty cool bass tones even out of some pretty horrendous sounding DIs.
How often do you use virtual drums for metal mixes?
Purely virtual drums, meaning like a drum instrument, it's almost only when I have MIDI as my drum performance, and that's it. If I have a recorded real drum set, which is still probably 90% of the time, but I will say projects I get for mixing with MIDI drums are becoming more common. So I've had to kind of get a lot more comfortable with some of those tools, but I'm always going to want to use a real recorded drum set given the opportunity. And then I'm more or less augmenting with samples if I'm using samples at all. And in that case, I'm probably using Slate Trigger, and I'm running samples from MIDI that I made from the actual drum performance. And it gives me a little more, like I have a lot of my own sounds on my own library that I've kind of built over, 25, 30 years, something, however long I've been doing this. And most of those are as trigger instruments. So that's where I prefer if I'm just blending samples with a real drum set. But if I have MIDI only, then it's probably a combination. So what I've done most of the time is I'll use a virtual instrument or a combination of them to reproduce my natural drum kit, and then all of that gets stemmed out, multi-tracked out to fit into the normal workflow I would normally work with a real drum set. And then I will still blend in my own samples with trigger if I feel that's necessary. So rather than switching from my combo of a real drum set and trigger augmentation samples to just only a virtual kit, I'm just using the virtual kit to replace the real drum set, and then the rest of my workflow more or less stays the same. So the virtual kit's going to take care of all of the cymbals essentially. And then part of the shells, like what I would normally be getting from the natural part, will be now a virtual drum set, but those will maintain full dynamics. And then I will still stack on top of that some of my usual sounds to help control dynamics in certain sections and just kind of stick with my main workflow. So at this point, I've been doing it for so long that I really I have an organization standard and a basic like project workflow that I like to stick with. And that just helps me move fast and know how to get to what I need to control like right away. And then all of the processing for those tracks is individual to each project for the most part. So I like to keep the organization and the workflow pretty consistent. But then that's kind of where like the templating, if you will, stops for the most part. So I don't get stuck in that trap of, making every record sound the same. And that's also why I like having natural drums as much as possible, because it just gives you that variance. You get just more variance in the performance because a real person is playing them. You get a little bit more unique sound stamp from the band. Typically, it's their gear and gear they've selected that they feel works with their music, even from like the cymbal arrangement and placement, where you can choose. Obviously, a drummer has full reign of that stuff, where virtual instruments, you're kind of constrained to how they've recorded that particular instrument. So, as much as I can, I'm going to go with a natural real drummer performance and augment on top of that if necessary. But you don't always have that opportunity when you're mixing. So,
how to make virtual metal drums sound realistic, in your opinion?
It's a combination of a lot of things. Selecting the virtual drums, for sure. That's a big part of it. Like, I'm a big fan of the Bogren stuff. I've talked about that a lot. Specifically, the Krim drums. I think it's just a fantastic sounding library. The cymbals sound really good. I obviously like the Superior drummer stuff, particularly the cymbals sound really good. The shells, in my opinion, are a little bit worn out just because it's kind of the most popular library. So I feel like people have become attuned and can kind of recognize the way the shells in the room sound a lot. So they're not bad by any means. They're great. But I tend to not go for those super often. The other kind of like maybe underdog library that has been around for a while and sounds really good is the Perfect Drums stuff. I think it's by like Naughty Dog is the company, and maybe now it's moved on. I think it's morphed to a different product, but it's still the same sample set. The Perfect Drum stuff is really good. I used that on a recent project and was pretty impressed with it. So that's part of the equation is the library you're using, but I think probably the more important part is just the programming. And you will just hope that whoever is programming the drums, which is not usually me, because like I mentioned, if I'm producing a project, I'm going to want to do real drums as much as possible. Not to say that I've never made MIDI drums, but typically if I'm working with a fully MIDI drum kit, it's a project I'm getting into mix. And hopefully in that case, whoever programmed the drums has done a good job of making them sound realistic. And that goes from beat selection to controlling the velocities specifically of cymbals, even more specifically of like hi-hats and rides, taking advantage of the multi-layered libraries for things like hi-hats and ride that have a lot of variability built into the instrument. If every hit is just, hi-hat open 5, velocity 127 or something like that, you're not going to get a very realistic performance. So taking care to make fills slightly lower velocity and have some varied dynamics and things like that's probably the main thing to making a virtual drum performance sound real and sound realistic. But that it all kind of goes hand in hand with your library as well. Specifically with cymbals, I feel like you sort of need to work in the same library from programming through mixing because things don't always correlate. Drums are sort of drums, like they're pretty consistent as far as velocity ranges between all the different instruments, but cymbals in particular, they all have their own way of handling the velocities and handling the different layers of those instruments like hi-hat and ride and cymbal grabs and things like that. So it's pretty helpful to pick a library that you feel sounds good to you and that you have access to and kind of work with that from programming all the way through final mixing.
How do you tame low end in a metal mix?
It's not, I guess tame is maybe not the right way to think about it. But it's a difficult one, and it's one of those questions that's the most difficult to answer because the straight shooting answer is I don't really know. I just kind of like go in there, and I guess some of the techniques that I've kind of subconsciously built throughout the years have helped me slowly get to a point where I'm pretty happy with the low end of my mixes now. You have to be careful about buildup, between your main elements, and that's like drums, kick drum primarily, floor tom somewhat, bass guitar, and then rhythm guitars, talking in metal context here. These days, production elements are becoming more popular as well. Everyone's kind of moving towards this like cinematic sound lately where there's lots of sub hits and like movie style risers and subs and synth and all these additional elements that I would say a good third or half of the projects I'm dealing with have a heavy element of that, or at least an element of that these days. And those typically play heavy in the low end as well, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's really nice to be able to just like lean on this synthetic element if you need a big low end impact, or you need a little extra sub in a chorus, and you just run a sub synth in there to help fill it out. That's nice in some ways because it gives you ultimate control over the way the low end affects a listener. But it's also a struggle because you're just adding more elements to an area of the mix that's already pretty crowded, which is the low end. So you just have to constantly be paying attention to it and try and keep things clean as you're mixing. I tend to, maybe my overall philosophy, and it's something that maybe wasn't an intentional thing, but I've sort of developed and fallen into, is trying to start with cleaner sounds. So when I'm dialing in sounds for tracking or when I'm in the early phases of a mix, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to clean up sounds and making them more precise and get rid of mud or cloudiness. And then I build my mix that way. And then I'll add some of that saturation and some of that vibe and some of that like pillowy glue back in on the mix bus. So I don't know if that's the best solution for everyone. It's just kind of been how I think my brain leans towards cleaner sounds. And then if I don't treat that later on to try and add some of that glue back, I'll end up with a sterile sounding mix. So some of my earlier mixes, I would say, do sound a little too sterile, a little too small and separated. And then I've kind of like gone through phases where I've probably pushed too hard in the other direction, where it's too saturated and it's too grimy and it's a little too big and too overwhelming. And I'm constantly kind of going back and forth trying to find that sweet spot of where I think I have just the right amount of saturation. And at this point, I'm talking about low end, but like kind of like everywhere in the spectrum, just the right amount of that glue and saturation where it feels cohesive, it feels massive and immense, and the mix just like washes over you and feels larger than life. But there's still that element of clarity. So it's a constant struggle because apparently for my brain, the sweet spot is like it's a really small, Goldilocks zone of mixing, if you will, that I'm constantly trying to dial into. So that's how I do it. I don't know if that's the best way for everyone, but I tend to start mixing fairly clean, fairly articulated. And then later on in the mix train, I'll add some of those saturation elements and mix bus compression and things like that kind of add some of that glue back in.
How to make rhythm guitars to cut through a metal mix?
Again, it all kind of starts at the source. A lot of what cuts through a metal mix is going to be that upper mid-range in guitars. But that's also what can like quickly ruin your mix and turn it into kind of a harsh mess. So, being very deliberate about how much and how the shape of that upper mid-range of a guitar tone, which a lot of it is shaped by the microphone and the cabinet you're using. It's probably like the majority of it comes from that. It's pretty important. I kind of have a few combos that I lean into that I know are going to give me pretty close to what I need specifically in that range. And then the other side of it is just the performance, and that I would encompass like not only the guitar and the player, so much of it is the players. So the more I do this, I realize how much tone is truly in the hands. I used to think that was bullshit when people said that, but it's absolutely not. A lot of it comes from the player, and then everything down from like the boost pedal. I'm almost always using a boost pedal these days, and I have a large collection. Probably have like 30 different boost pedals that I will occasionally use, but maybe 5 of them are like go-tos. And I'll try a lot of them out. I pull out a pedal board and I've got I'll pick 4 or 5 to put on, and I compare them, and then I'll start pulling ones that obviously aren't working with that particular source and compare others. Sometimes I'm even blending them these days. A lot of the leak alarm pedals that I like have blend functions. So I've done that a lot recently where I'll blend 2 boost pedals just to get that perfect response. And that goes in, that feeds into that clarity. That takes the performance and controls the saturation into the amp just right, where you're getting the right saturation on palm mutes, but it's not so overblown that everything is getting kind of fuzzed out. And that all feeds into clarity. The boost pedal selection has a lot to do with getting that clarity and getting the performance to cut through in just the right way, without sounding flubby, without sounding harsh. So that's part of it. It's just it's a hard question to just nail down to like one simple trick, which is like what, so much of music production is like. It's kind of like 100 things that all boil down to like one final product. And guitar clarity is one of the more complicated ones, but those are some of the places where I'm going to look at first: boost pedal, cab, and amp selection, and then just how you treat your upper mids in the mix.
My next question is, what tips can you give on using saturation in a metal mix? Where you should use saturation in the mix, and how?
So I can only kind of speak to my personal experience, and that's kind of the beautiful and probably frustrating part of music production, is that so many different techniques can work. Depends on how you wrap it. One of the things I've learned digging into a few of these nail the mixes is like people have wildly different workflows and mixing ideologies, and can all these different methods can get to a really killer sound. So I can only really speak to my own experience, but the way I've used it is by using it in small amounts in several places. So I'm a big fan of the Slate virtual console and virtual tape stuff. Probably since it first came out, it just resonated with me the most, and I have not yet replaced it. Even though it's fairly old tech at this point in the plugin world, it just sounds right to me, and it's kind of been built into my workflow. So I lean on that, and they're pretty subtle, and that's one of the things I like about them. Is most tracks in a mix are going to have console or tape or both. But it doesn't add a ton. It's a very subtle coloration, very subtle saturation, depending on how you're leaning into it. And then I'll add stages as I go too. So I like saturation on drums and bass particularly. And so I'll use tools like, what's the one? Sugar Process Audio, I believe, is the company, and the plugin's called Sugar. It's a pretty cool, pretty simple interface, but powerful way to add multi-band saturation that's pretty controllable. I'll do some of that on my bus processing, and then I'll end up stacking more saturation on the mix bus. And sometimes that comes from hardware. Like I have an SSL Fusion that I'll use that drive knob on occasionally. I also have a THD control on my hardware bus compressor, which is the Wes Audio NG bus comp. So that's got THD as well as like an iron circuit, which engages a transformer that you can push into more or less to get a little bit of that transformer saturation. Oh, there's a fly in here. It's driving me nuts. And then I'm stacking small amounts in different places of the mix. I used to use Oxford Inflator a good amount. These days, I've mostly moved on to what is it called? Here we go. The Sound Theory Crafter. I don't know if you guys, you can see it in the frame here. This is kind of like the new version of Inflator that gives you a little more control that I've moved over to, but also adds a bit of soft clipping and a bit of saturation. But any of these one elements, if I were to turn them off, it wouldn't make a huge difference to the mix. And I think for my workflow, that's the key to saturation, is adding gentle saturation at multiple stages of the mix. And then it kind of adds up to that glue that doesn't feel like any one particular sound is overpowering the mix.
And my final question is, how do you handle big sessions? What tips on session optimization you can give?
Stay organized. Build a workflow that stays consistent between projects. Specifically, when you're doing lots of different mixes, and these days, artists expect you to be able to jump into a mix and tweak something at a minute's notice, because that's what DAWs have done to this kind of industry and the workflow. So keeping consistency with your organizational methods and your workflow helps you be really fast and malleable when you're moving between different projects. So that's, I think, probably the number one tip is develop a workflow, and that is everything from organizing tracks in your projects to using folders when necessary to, in my case, I have like a system of group tracks or buses that stay the same almost between every project. And then depending on the elements that I'm mixing, they all feed into the same amount of group tracks. And it just gives me quick access to, if I need rhythm guitars or lead guitars or bass or kick or snare or my drum butts, it's all kind of right where I expect it. And it lands on my mixing surface when I need to use that, or it's just like I am very comfortable with the organization of the tracks into buses, into the mix bus, and the signal flow stays very consistent between all projects. And I've kind of developed one that is universal enough that almost anything I need to mix can fit into this same workflow. And it makes it so I'm not hunting for things. If I hear something, I need to be able to act on it immediately. That's how, like, at least my creative brain works, is I just have to, like, when I hear something that I feel needs a change, I have to immediately know where to go to manipulate that particular sound or source or feel. And keeping the organization clean helps you get there.
Thanks so much, Dave, for such a wonderful interview. It was a huge pleasure talking to you. And once again, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the invite.